What's going on, everyone? I'm Jeff St. Pierre, and this is episode 150 of the Adult Education Podcast. Today, I am speaking with author and journalist Adam Chandler. When it comes to work, we've all heard all the different sayings, right? If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's no substitute for hard work. It's the message that's been beaten into our heads since birth. You know, America was built on hard work, and if you work hard, then you'll see success. It all sounds great, right? What if I told you it was just a whole bunch of crap? We're about a month and a half into 2025 and burnout rates are already climbing sky high. In fact, a new study found that job burnout is at an all-time high. People are working longer hours for less pay, and yet they're still looked down on if they don't find success. So what happened? Why does it seem like the American dream is getting further out of reach? Maybe it's because it never really existed at all. Author and journalist Adam Chandler has traveled the country and the world to talk about work, to look at the history of work in America. What he found is all those quotes about work and all that messaging about working hard and you'll be successful is really nothing but a myth. Going back as far as Columbus and the Pilgrims, there have been tales about what comes from hard work, but that's all they are. Tales. Sure, there have been times in history when people have been able to prosper, but even then, it wasn't without support from other outside sources. Chandler discusses his findings in his new book, 99% Perspiration, a new working history of the American way of life. We had a great chat about this. In fact, I thought it was really fascinating, trying to determine if these tales about working hard were just the natural progression of stories being passed down through generations, or if they were carefully designed to keep certain people in line. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, there he is. How's it going?
Good.
First of all, great to talk to you, Adam, the author of 99% Perspiration, a new working history of the American way of life. Speaking of working, I was checking out your Instagram, and it looks like you're kind of all over the place lately. I feel like you were just in D.C. I think Puerto Rico popped up on there at some place. You're definitely working hard, getting out there.
I'm trying to, it's as much as I'm, working on a book about how we need to relax a little bit more and take more time off, focus on our families and communities. This is obviously a time where I'm kind of running around crazy, but it's good because we're in a wild moment. People have a lot of feelings about where things are, and it's been actually really good to talk to folks about how they're feeling about the world, the country, their lives in a different way.
Yeah, I'm actually glad I came across this book because this idea of, almost, I know this isn't the central point, but almost like the idea of work being our personal identity and, all of that. It's been such a big part of my life lately because my dad just retired recently and he's been struggling with that. One of my coworkers is going through the end of her career and she's been really we'll have conversations and I'm like, don't you want to enjoy this time that you have with your grandkids and all they can think about is work? What am I going to do without working all the time? And I just think yeah, I get it. It's nice to have something to do. It's nice to have purpose. But at the same time, why is work the only thing that you can identify with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this isn't a problem that Americans alone suffer from, but it is something that we do have a bigger sort of challenge with, in part because of how much work defines us as people. Years ago, decades ago, we had more civic organizations and religious groups and affiliations and those kinds of things that kept us tighter knit as communities. And over the past 20 or 30 years in particular, we've seen that decline. And that means that work has kind of filled that gap. And that can be a dangerous thing if your identity is wrapped up in work, because work is fickle, man. Things can fall apart at a job. Industries change. There's always a lot going on. And even if you are working in a dream job, it can be ultimately a nightmare. While I was reporting the book, one stat that jumped out to me was the Fortune 500 companies that existed in the year 2003, 52% of them by the year 2023, just 20 years later, were gone. Those are companies that were lost to mergers or acquisitions or went out of business or ultimately were kind of dismantled or sold for parts, whatever it is. But these are the biggest companies that you dream of working at. That's something that you want. If I worked at an enormous company like that, I would feel like my life is pretty good and that I'm safe in whatever it is that I'm doing. But even those folks have seen a lot of upheaval in their lives, and those are, theoretically the best kinds of jobs you can hope for are the ones at these enormously successful companies. And that's not a guarantee of sort of safety or security at this point either.
Interesting you talk about that. I know this is kind of off topic, but I was just listening to another podcast where they were talking about sort of the tech world and how we have these major tech companies that have essentially bought up all their competition. And we look at these companies and we think, what a successful company. But they also say like merging is actually terrible for our economy. Like having more companies like that would be better because it breeds innovation, it breeds growth, so like actually having one or two companies buy everything, it might look successful to the everyday person, but it's really hurting us more in the long term because now you have two people on top of the mountain and everybody else is down here at the bottom.
Right, right. It's bad for consumers too. It makes things more
Sure.
expensive when, there are only a couple of airlines or only a couple of, car rental places or grocery conglomerates competing against each other. They can kind of do whatever they want, and it limits the opportunities that small businesses have to kind of get their foothold in things, and that's been a problem. It's sort of the dream of opening a small business and having it grow slowly and sustainably has kind of been replaced by opening a business and hoping you get acquired, and that's that just kind of changes what our priorities are in a lot of ways.
I know through your life as an author, as a reporter or journalist, you have talked to people across the country talking about work and all that. But what was the impetus for this book in particular? What was the thing that made you say, you know what, I want to see how we view this here in America and why it seems so strange?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. My last book was about the history of fast food in America.
Mhm.
And I traveled around the country talking to people in the fast food industry, from cashiers and workers, to people who own franchises, to corporate executives at places like McDonald's or Burger King. And what was interesting to me is that there's this huge divide in that industry where there are the people who became millionaires, basically working their way up from the cashier stands or the register or the fryers, all the way up to becoming corporate executives. And their story about it is that, like, look, I just worked hard and I plugged myself in and I did everything I needed to do, and I got to this really great place where I'm extremely wealthy and life is great. And all I had to do was work hard, and all that anyone needs to do is work hard. And they have these modern employees who are working in fast food restaurants, and they don't really seem to have a shot at this. Education is too expensive, healthcare is too expensive, housing is expensive. There's so many obstacles that are in the way of people getting to that same place. If you're starting out right now, and I thought that's a fascinating divide that we should explore more when we talk about opportunity in this country, because that we are really divided about whether it is your own personal ability to just grind it out and keep working as hard as possible, or whether there are other factors that really influence whether you're going to have that life that you dream of. And we focus in America on the individual, and I think a lot of it has to do with external factors, what the economy looks like, what the cost of everything is, what opportunities there are in certain communities that there used to be but don't exist anymore. And it's worth talking about those things, because if you don't succeed here, it is seen as a failure of kind of character, like you didn't have the grit to get it done. And that makes success or failure kind of shameful depending on what the outcome is. And I worry about that as a bigger problem.
I think one of the interesting things about that too is that time has just changed, but the people that have the microphones in front of their faces the most are people that lived during a time when that could be true. Like one of my favorite examples is Mitch McConnell. I heard him tell this story a few years ago when they were talking about student loan debt and all this stuff. And he was talking about how he worked at like an ice cream shop or soda shop or something when he was in college, University of Louisville. Back in 1960, I think it was. And he was like, I worked here part-time and I paid for my tuition. Now, I looked it up before you and I connected here today just to try to see what tuition was. I couldn't find it for 1960, but in 1988, it was about $1,500 for an in-state student to go to University of Louisville. I would imagine it was less in 1960, 20 years, 30 years prior. Now
Sure.
It's $45,000 or something like that. So you can't, like, that's more than the average income for an American in this country for a whole year. So the times are just different and people need to recognize that, but they don't. They can't acknowledge that things are just different now than they were 60 years ago.
Exactly. That's a really great point, and it kind of points to how our economy since 1979 has more than doubled in size. but workers are 64% more productive, and still they're only getting paid 17% more than they were. And so if you don't have a college degree, or if you're a person of color, you're actually making less today in real wages than you were in the 1970s, which is kind of astounding if you think about it. It's not just about things getting more expensive. It's about how the pay gap and disparity in those things have changed. And it's important to talk about that, because opportunity really is this defining part of American life. We don't have a strong social safety net. Your healthcare is often tied into whether or not you have a job, or a good job will give you perhaps parental leave or paid leave or sick leave, any of those things to deal with the problems that or realities of life.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of jobs don't have those things, and it makes it kind of impossible to keep up. And we really blame individuals for falling behind because of that. But it really is all of these other factors that play into it too.
It's kind of fascinating and sort of infuriating too, about how much now that the phrase that you use, it's kind of the overarching phrase in the book, is American abracadabra. And it is sort of this like story that we've told ourselves all these years, and that a lot of people have bought into. And you can't seem to get that away from them. Like this idea that if you don't make it, you're a failure. Well, no, that's not real. But people they really believe that strong, or it's like the welfare queen during the Reagan years. Like, people still believe that's a real thing. And sure, maybe there are a handful of people that take advantage of the system that way, but there's also a lot of billionaires that take advantage of the system that way too. But it's hard to, I don't understand how we can't get people to like snap out of it. How come we can't get people to realize that they're being fooled? I guess, I don't know if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great problem that we're battling around this perception of American life. And you understand why it's seductive. It's
Sure.
romantic. The idea that you can just transcend your circumstances through hard work and grit. It's a beautiful idea. And for some people, it's been true. It's just, unfortunately, it's less true now than it's been in decades past. And it's part of what's dividing us. It's part of what's keeping us angry at each other, because we are not focusing on the reasons why it is so hard to succeed. Instead, we're pointing fingers at each other as people, and saying, this person's not working hard enough, or it's people are pouring across the border, and they're the reasons why we're not able to get good jobs. And the reality is that, there are so many other factors that are systemic and structural that are causing these challenges, and we have to look at those too. And there are a lot of people who don't want you to look at those, because it's just, again, that's where the power is. And I'm not a radical by any stretch of the imagination, but even just talking to people, I traveled around the country for this book, and I talked to people in Indiana and Alabama, and I talked to people in Los Angeles. And even though these people might disagree on some fundamental politics, when you talk about opportunity and what's right and what's common sense, there's so much overlap about what people think about what is fundamentally right. And that's actually kind of what's inspiring about being able to report on these topics, is that if you get people in the same room and you get past the like immediate labels and quick reactions to things, people have very similar aspirations for what a good life is and what it means in America. And I think that it's important for us to keep an eye on, because we're divided by these really superficial things. And at the core of it, we really do want something that is similar across the board.
Sure. I mean, everybody wants a happy, healthy life, and they all want their kids to have better lives than they did. I mean, that's kind of the goal for everyone. It's just interesting how the messaging has been shifted, like you just said, that in a way that it keeps us at each other instead of, what's the phrase I was just reading recently? It was like something about like the $500 an hour guy convinced the $25 an hour guy that the $12 an hour guy is the problem. And it's like, yes. But how did that happen? How did we let them convince us of this?
It's such a crucial part of today's calculus politically and socially. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have privileged work over family and friendship and community. We do work more hours than all of the countries we compare ourselves to. We do take fewer days off than the countries we compare ourselves to. We have less time for sleep and leisure and socializing than they do in Western Europe and other places that have similar economies to us and basically have the same standards of living as we do. It's a good thing to investigate that and ask why we don't have enough sort of built-in separation between work and life and everything else outside of the office, because those are the things that I think keep us from really understanding what other people are going through. It is a fascinating part of, again, being out in the world and reporting and talking to people, is just kind of hearing, I know I'm in a bubble. I live in New York. I grew up in Texas. I had two different bubbles, right?
Sure.
But when I break those bubbles, I realize that there are so many things that I just have no access to, problems that people have that I don't understand. And it's not a red or a blue or an urban or a rural thing. It's just a human thing in a lot of ways. And that sounds kind of Pollyannish, but we're having difficulty talking and finding people that live in different circumstances than ourselves, because we're polarized by not just politics, but by economies. Studies have shown people are living in neighborhoods that are less diverse, both politically and economically, than they have been, in 30 or 40 years. Even though we think of ourselves as this great melting pot, it's very easy to go through your life and not meet people who have a very different point of view than you. And if you do encounter them, oftentimes it's online, which is a terrible way to express and sort of expose yourself to new beliefs. I think that is another factor that kind of fits into this sort of jigsaw of despair that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, even, along that same point, it's like the idea of the middle class, right? Like everybody wants to be a part of the middle class, but people that identify as what they think is the middle class, a lot of them are actually kind of teetering on the poverty line, but they live a life that they feel has been sold to them as this middle class life, but really they're not doing as well as they want. Like the middle class life is actually a lot more expensive now than it was 20 years ago, but people don't, again, it's the messaging. They haven't quite picked up on the difference.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, if you're actually doing pretty well, you don't feel like you're doing pretty well because people around you are perhaps doing better. You're only seeing on social media or whatever else it is that they're doing really well. They're going on lavish vacations or doing other things, or there's a sense of precarity that goes all the way up the financial ladder, so that people making joint household making $400,000 a year feels like they're falling behind their peers because there's so much else going on. And there's so much impressive social things that make you feel like you're not keeping up, or that you need to do more to keep up, instead of kind of being happy with what you have and focusing on things that aren't about, again, wealth creation or attaining things so much as being part of community and being happy with what you have.
I thought it was interesting in the book too, like you go all the way back when we're talking about American abracadabra again, you go all the way back, you're telling stories about Columbus, the Pilgrims, and talking about how they shared these stories that weren't necessarily true, or the things that we learned in school as kids. I think you and I are roughly the same age. The things that we learned in school as kids were not necessarily true to life, but I kept reading it thinking, well, to the victor go the spoils, right? Like they are the ones writing the history books. They are the ones that are allowed to tell you whatever history they want. But it is interesting to think about, like, we still look at things that happened 300 years ago, 400 years ago, whatever it is, and we still view that as this is how we should live our lives today because they did it so long ago. And I thought it was so interesting how it wasn't even really how they did it.
Right. One thing that always jumps out to me is this idea that we had this beautiful founding moment where everybody got along and all the founding fathers just decided we're going to throw off the yoke of British tyranny and we're going to become this united nation that is going to, change the world with its democratic ideals. And that's not what happened at all. I live in New York, and that New York was an area that wanted to remain part of Britain. They were loyalists. They were very much opposed to it. And what ultimately happened was not that the founding fathers all agreed. They worked together and they compromised, and it was painful. There were a lot of concessions. There were a lot of different ideas and ideologies and sort of religious pressures and social pressures and sort of ethnic enclaves that influenced how we ultimately became a country. And instead of looking back on those days as being this moment where all Americans were united, it's a better story for us to look back on those days and say, these were some people who really fundamentally disagreed with each other and even hated each other. But they found a way to work together, and they found a way to solve huge existential crises that almost sank the nation. We didn't have the Constitution to start the country. We had the Articles of Confederation, and it didn't work out. We did a lot of trial and error, and we found a way to make it work. Even though it's always been kind of messy, we still found a way to make it work. And that's a better story than this idea that we know what the founders wanted or what the framers intended. It's about us being interdependent and open to compromise and working with each other. That's actually the better story here. It makes us stronger to think of ourselves that way. instead of coming up with some magical idea that we were all, united as one nation, just ready to happen, ready to spring to life in, the 1700s.
You just mentioned how sometimes these guys didn't even like each other. And I love in the book how you point out that people like didn't like Ben Franklin and kind of called him out for just being a jackass.
Yeah. Ben Franklin was insufferable. And, Ben Franklin is held up as this person who was, again, he was no doubt a genius, but his strengths are that he came from nothing. And he grew up in poverty, and he found his way into a lot of wealth in his life. And he was a tinkerer, and he was, a great speaker and a great writer, and had a brilliant mind. But he also made his wealth at a time when the United States had poverty and had slavery. You can't exactly say that you made it in a system that was very, very crooked and that profited off of enslaved people's work that was uncompensated. He, as a publisher, printed notices for runaway enslaved people, and profited off of people seeking to recapture enslaved people who'd run away. That's not a moral way to wealth, even though he's upheld as this exemplar of hard work and grit and ingenuity. He was also somebody who managed to profit from a system that was inherently unfair. And it's not shameful to say that. It's actually a better version of the story to say, yeah, Benjamin Franklin was this really fascinating American character, but he also came of age and made his wealth in a time that was inherently unfair. And we can look at things like that and say, there's an interesting story about America that we can tell that is a little more complicated. And that's better for us as people to kind of cling to and to sort of understand about ourselves. Otherwise, we're just idealizing these things that weren't real, these mythologies that weren't true, that are just more complicated.
So do you think, this might be a complicated question, do you think this idea of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and you just got to work hard to make it, I mean, do you think it is a story that is designed to sort of separate us? Or do you think it's a story that's just kind of grown over the decades and the, centuries that has gotten to this point where we're sort of like stuck with it? Or do you, because I know you talk about individualism was used. Herbert Hoover was one that really pushed the individualism idea, and that was right around the Great Depression. So how did that really work out? But like, I wonder, like, are some of these things purposefully designed to keep us in a place, or is it just the story that's happened and we just haven't quite realized we have to break out of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it is a tough question. It is a complicated question. I think it's a balance. There have been times where the country has really invested in bringing people closer to the opportunity and social mobility than we realize. The GI Bill is a great example of how the country invested in people by giving them access to education in exchange for service for their country. And that helped build a middle class, a durable, educated middle class. We invested in people after the Great Depression by giving jobs and training, and we electrified rural areas. And after the Civil War, we focused on building colleges and transcontinental railroads, and also had a Freedmen's Bureau, which was essentially this organization that helped alleviate poverty. When we invest in people and give them access to tools to actually be socially mobile, we see great things happen. And right now, that balance is very much out of whack. We don't give people the opportunities or the tools to be socially mobile in the way that you can if you work hard. So it's not that the idea of working hard is itself inherently bad. It's just that it should pay off. If you're working as much as people do in this country, and we work crazy hours and for not enough money, it should work out for you, that your effort should be rewarded and that things should go your way, essentially. And that's not the case right now, but we can look to other instances in the past where it has been and ask good questions about why. And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, we work so hard. We work harder than other places, like you mentioned. And a lot of people wear it like a badge of honor. Like, I can't even tell you, in December every year, I work for a company that does offer paid vacation time to its full-time employees. And every December, when we know they're going to run out, there are guys in my office that are like, I didn't use all my vacation time. I just really had to put in the hours. And I'm like, yeah, but that's your time that was given to you. Like, no one is patting you on the back going, thanks for coming in. Like, you're losing that time. And I don't understand the mindset of the badge of honor. Like one of my coworkers works 10 to 12 hours a day. He doesn't need to. People ask him why he's there. His boss will ask him why he's there 10 hours to 12 hours a day, but he's there all the time. And his relationship with his kids suffers. He's gone through divorces. Like, and I don't understand the mentality of, well, I'm working really hard. Like, but what are you losing by working really hard? You're not gaining anything.
Yeah, it's seen as this concept of work theater, staying at the office, grinding it out till 7 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night is seen as heroic and a real American get it done kind of concept. But if you go to other places, and again, life isn't perfect in France by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're working at 7 o'clock at the office in a place like France, in some offices there, I won't say all of them, but enough of them to where there's a cultural norm around the hours that you work, it's not seen as heroic. It's not seen as that you are so committed to your work. People will see that and ask, is the company understaffed? Is this person like in the wrong role or working really inefficiently? Is there some kind of problem here? Because there, under no circumstances should someone be at the office this late. It's actually seen as a problem or a detriment that somebody would still be at the office that late. And that's unfathomable to Americans. The thought that working late isn't some kind of badge of honor or a way to show that you are committed to your company and to your profession, and you're serious about yourself and your work. That just doesn't translate to American English in that way. And it's something that it kind of baffles you when you go other places and you meet people who say, I leave the office at 4:30 every day. It's not a problem. It's encouraged because they want me to get home, pick up my kids, have a good meal with them, and be ready and rested and recharged for work. And there are studies that show that when you have enough time away from the office, you work better. You're more creative. You're more loyal to your company. You don't burn out. You have better ideas, and you are just generally happier and physically more fit and just in better shape emotionally too. And those are the things that we tend to lose when we talk about the sacrifices we make for our careers and our professions. And companies lose too. One stat in this, while researching this book that always kind of blows my mind when I think about it is American businesses lose $1 trillion every year, $1 trillion with a T, to attrition, to workers leaving jobs that they can't stand to stay at anymore because the pay isn't good enough, the life isn't good enough, or there are some kind of imbalances or inconsistencies that make them just want to quit the jobs that they have and go somewhere else. No trajectory for opportunity, whatever it is. But imagine how much money you would save companies would save if they invested more in their workers, taking time off, having clearer sort of boundaries between work and after work. If you didn't feel exhausted or spread too thin, companies would make more money by keeping people around, by having people who they've trained and invested in stick it out for the long haul because they realize they have something good around them. And that's, again, part of the story that gets sort of swept under the rug because it's just not the American way that we're familiar with. The American way that we're familiar with is burn the candle at both ends, work hard, play hard. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that until you lose all sense of self, until you're miserable, until you lose that dream job. And then you realize your social life or your personal life is very much completely eroded or degraded by the fact that you focus so much on your career. And these are real problems that I think are alienating us and making it very difficult for people to be comfortable in their own skin and happy in their lives.
I totally agree. I know I have to let you go here, but my wife has been watching that show. Was it Emily in Paris? I think it is.
Yeah.
And, I've caught a few episodes here and there where I kind of find it insufferable. But the parts of it that I did kind of enjoy were where they would go to like a party, this American girl's working in Paris, if you haven't seen it. And they would go to like a party after hours and she'd be trying to network. And all the French workers would be like, what the hell is wrong with you? This is a party. Just enjoy yourself. No one wants to talk work here. But it's like, what an American thing. Like everywhere we go, the first question you ask is, what do you do? That's the first thing every time. And that just watching that on screen was just so funny to me. I was like, this is real. This is us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wrote about that show in the book, and it's funny because, first of all, the show is pretty bad. And my wife, who's named Emily, will not watch it with me.
That's funny.
But I was, starting to write a book about work, and I'm like, here's the perfect example of a cultural artifact that the show only works because you have an American worker who's like career driven and very focused, who ends up at a French office where none of that is a value. People don't see that as a virtue, that she is work obsessed and just gunning for her next promotion and trying to climb the corporate ladder. And as a result, she's completely alienated by it. And, again, it's just the show only works because we have this idea of France as a place where leisure and life is important, and America as a place where working really hard and being careerist is a cherished value. And having those two things collide is kind of funny. Even if the show is not perfect, the idea of it is funny because of how ingrained those ideals are. And at any rate, it is funny to sort of look at French culture and French work culture, which I spent a lot of time in France doing that in the book, just to give us an idea of what about it is different. Why are we so different from other countries, and what does it look like to not prioritize work in this way? And I think it's a good question.
Well, Adam, I love the book. I have not finished it yet, so I have to get to that part where you talk about Emily in Paris. I have not gotten to that part yet, but fascinating work. I think it's so interesting to talk about this stuff. The book is 99% Perspiration, A New Working History of the American Way of Life. I love the cover. I love it all. Adam, is there a place people can go to find out more info about you or just follow along with your journeys?
Sure. I always point to my website, adamchandler.com, and that is a pretty good way to follow up with the work that I'm doing. I'm touring around and talking about the book, and just, I like hearing people's stories. My email's there, so people write in and kind of share their wisdom with me, and that always, that's always appreciated too. So at any rate, Jeff, it's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Yeah, Adam, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And thanks for doing this work. I got to check out your first book too, because I want to read more about the fast food life as well. I'm really curious about that.
All right. Both are unhealthy things. So there you go.
Big thank you to Adam Chandler for his time. His latest book, 99% Perspiration, A New Working History of the American Way of Life, is available now wherever you get your books. I hope you check it out. And thank you for listening to the Adult Education Podcast today. I appreciate you sharing some of your time with me. Till next time, be well.